A very warm welcome to anyone who's listening in, watching this on YouTube as well as on Zoom. Um, and of course, a happy World Otter Day, right? And it's generally on the last Wednesday of May every year. Uh, and what I'm going to do when I start off, this is primarily focused on India, but this one slide really shows you the distribution of otters worldwide. And as you can see here, there are 13 species of otters found all over the world. And it's found pretty much on every continent except Australia and Antarctica. And out of these two species of otters, the sea otter and the marine otter, are actually saltwater animals. They aren't really freshwater species. And it's very interesting for us to see that the largest otter in the world is the one that is found in the Amazon. And there are two subspecies of that, and those are the giant otters. And giant otters can be really, really big. They can be the length of an adult human being. And there are some wonderful videos on YouTube of their courage and their ability to chase a jaguar away from the water. But we won't get into those details. So you do see a number of species, 13 of them. But here's the not so good news. 12 of them out of these 13 species are really declining in number worldwide. What we do know is that the one that is on the top of your screen, the Eurasian otter, where my cursor is right now, that's the one that is more or less stable in population. And that's primarily because in Europe and in Great Britain, in particular, in the United Kingdom, there's been concerted efforts to protect it in the last 30 to 40 years. And it has made some kind of a comeback in many riparian ecosystems there. But except for that, and that incidentally is found across Europe and parts of Asia, and in India, there is a story about it I'm going to tell you. But apart from the Eurasian otter, pretty much every other otter species across the world seems to be in trouble. Many of them are in the vulnerable or greater than that list, right? So what we are going to do is, having talked about the Eurasian otter, let's move away from looking at the worldwide scenario to looking at the Indian scenario here. And in India, we have the Eurasian otter as well. And it is found, or it was known to be found in the eastern and the western Himalayas, and recorded sporadically in the northeast, in Sikkim, for example, in the western Himalayas in certain parts. But fascinatingly enough, in the last few years, and I'm talking about really 4 to 10 years, we've been receiving reports of their presence in some very unusual landscapes. The Chilka Lake, for example, or the central Indian ecosystem, where there are rivers now that have been seen to be hosting the Eurasian otter as a result of camera trap images, right? So we really don't know enough about its distribution in India, and time, as in everything else, will tell. So I'm going to not focus on this otter too much. What you do need to keep in mind is the fact that it has a very interestingly rounded tail. And this is quite different from another species, which is what my colleague and I have been working on for so many years. And this is a fascinating record of the Eurasian otter in Ladakh, of all places, in about this message. This news item is from about 4 years ago. The Eurasian otter actually present in Ladakh, and the title was A King in Hiding, and I thought that was so beautiful to read. It's classified as near threatened by the IUCN. And it talks about how the playful antics give otters an adorable air, and in the river ecosystem, they are the apex predator. So much for the Eurasian otter. Let's move on to looking at the otter that I have spent a fair bit of the last few years trying to see in the wild for the first time. And I've never seen it in the wild, though obviously one has seen lots of photographs, and that too from camera trap images. And this is the smallest otter in the world, the small clawed otter. What you can see here is, from the map here, what you can see is that its distribution is in the Western Ghats, particularly in the streams of the Western Ghats and some of the rivers at their upper reaches, sporadically in the Eastern Ghats and in Northeast India for sure. Now, this otter is typically the icon of the stream, the icon of the wetlands, the icon of paddies, for example. Fascinatingly, their food is not so much fish as mollusks and crustaceans, crabs, for instance. And therefore, traditionally, in paddy fields, for instance, in Kodagu, in Coorg, they have been spotted in the monsoons at the time of planting of paddy. But as pesticides and fertilizers found their way, what we have noticed is that the species has declined in numbers and exited those ecosystems. So our work has focused on both sides of the Brahmagiri hill ranges which separate Karnataka from Kerala. And what we have seen is a very diverse or a very interesting sort of distribution definition where when there are human dominated landscapes where there are people, to cut it short, otters, small clawed otters seem to be very few in numbers and very reclusive, but in the forest ecosystems upstream or sometimes as a part of the same landscape, their density and abundance seems to be much higher. They are primarily, and I'm going to show you a lovely photograph from Yashpal, taken by Yashpal Rathor's camera trap. They are primarily nocturnal and crepuscular. Which crepuscular, for those of you who don't know what that means, they're primarily active in the early mornings, the dawn and the dusks, and through the night. And what we do know is that their numbers certainly seem to be declining. I'm just going to go back to the earlier slide and give you reasons. And if you look at the bit in red there, across the world, there is capturing of this otter for the pet trade, not in India, but in other parts of the world. And to certain extent, they are hunted for meat and for their pelt. Um, in India, we are noticing one more threat in little streams which are habitat by people on weekends, for instance. I often find when I enter the stream that I need to wear gumboots because of the amount of glass bottles and glass shards that are littering the bottom of the stream. And I'm absolutely sure that this could represent a fairly serious threat to this species. We know very little about what are the real threats in certainly the Western Ghat ecosystem. But we do know that a certain amount of hunting happens. We do know that having, the kind of amount of glass that is thrown into water cannot be good for it, certainly. So not really understood. We need to do a lot more. But what we have seen in the Brahmagiri ranges, for instance, is when we enter the forest ecosystems, the population, the density seems to be significantly better than outside. I'm going back to Yashpal's photo. It's a beautiful little photo and they're incredibly adorable and cute. And even as we look at this, why is it actually called the short clawed or the small clawed otter? And this is why it is so. Pretty self-explanatory there. And when we are looking for this otter, because it's very reclusive, because it's nocturnal and crepuscular, we don't really see it. So what we have to do is to rely on paw prints and on spraint, which is another word for poop or scat, right? And there's a fairly high degree of loyalty to spraint sites of both these species. But when we are looking at paw prints, this recessed thumb, for example, where my cursor is a pretty distinctive identification mark. And we know from the absence of claws, which is always there for the smooth coated, we know that this is not the smooth coated, right? Now, here's an interesting point I must bring up right over here, which is that in many river systems, including the Kaveri, there seems to be a sort of zone or a stretch of overlap between these two species, where both the species are actually found, the smooth-coated otter and the small-clawed otter. And we still don't understand how well they coexist, because I'm going to come to the smooth-coated otter in a minute, and that can be pretty active nocturnally as well. But otherwise, by and large, they are mutually exclusive in territory. The small clawed is found in the upper reaches, the smooth coated is typically found in the lower reaches in a relative sense, where the water flow is much higher and the depth could be more. And that's the distinction between the two as far as paw prints are concerned, which sort of logically leads me to talk about the smooth coated now. So let's, for a moment, look at the smooth coated otter, which is something my colleague Anit and I have worked on for so many years along the Kaveri as conservationists. We know certain stretches of the river where there are decent populations of smooth coated and where there are issues, and conservation is of urgent importance. And that's where we've really been focusing our attention. If you remember, when I was talking about the Eurasian a little while ago, I talked about its rounded tail. Now, from a distance, certainly from images where the otters are not very clear in the images, it's not very easy to make out between the smooth-coated and the Eurasian. If you get a close-up, it's a lot easier, but at a distance, it isn't. The one thing that sometimes is a giveaway is the fact that the smooth-coated otter has a flat tail, unlike the Eurasian otter, which has a rounded tail. Here, of course, the tail isn't very visible, but that's where it is. And the other interesting thing to know is that they belong to a class called the mustelids, and the hump that you see on the back is very distinctive of the mustelids. The smooth-coated otter is found in, the distribution of the smooth-coated otter is interesting. It's found, at least as far as the otter specialist group map is concerned, it's found in most parts of India, with the exception of the central Indian landscape and going down to Southeast Asia. The reality is that sometime in the 80s and 90s and going up to the mid 2000s, there was a concerted, coordinated sort of poaching effort that happened across the country. Populations of this otter dramatically fell. In fact, there were certain river systems like the Chambal where they probably went virtually extinct. They have now repopulated parts of the Chambal, but we are going back to the work done by Professor Hussain of WII. And he was part of a film which brought out this plight some years ago, I think it was about 20, 25 years ago, a film called And Then There Were None. What we also found from our work along the Kaveri is that the poachers came down to the Kaveri, and they actually were working with fishermen who used to find this otter troublesome, and they still do, because the otter picks fish off fishing nets, and they damage the net in the process and damage the fish in the process. So otters and fishers have a history of conflict, and the fishers used to show the poachers the location of the dens and so on, and a fairly coordinated poaching effort did happen. And somewhere in the late part of the first decade, that is somewhere around between 2005 and 2010 of this century, poaching seems to have substantially come down. But it can always rear its head again. And the question you might have in your mind is, why were they poached? And the answer to that is for pelt. And this pelt, or the skin or the coat of the otter, found its way through Tibet into China, from where it was exported often in handbags, through handbags, etc., to the rest of the world. And that's such a sad way to see one of our iconic animals actually perish. The good news is that once poaching stopped, otter populations in some parts has seemed to have made a recovery. We don't know for sure, as far as we don't have a national picture, but we certainly have a picture of certain parts of the Kaveri. And when I refer to these rivers, by the way, I'm referring to outside the protected areas. Not, for instance, I'm not talking about otter populations inside the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, where there was a fairly high level of protection and they remained and continue to remain well protected. I'm talking about places outside the wildlife areas where there was systematic poaching that actually happened. And if you look at the work that we have done, so one of the interesting features, the otter den is called a holt. And there's a different language for otters, a different nomenclature. The holt in this case this is not really it looks like a tent, and it's not really a hut of any kind. It's just an uprooted tree. And when we were rowing past, We went in and investigated and found that, well, otters had been there. There were clear signs that they were habiting the place. And of course, we gave it a wide berth subsequently. So holes are typically places in the roots of trees, either in this case uprooted, but it need not be uprooted. It could be the Terminalia arjuna tree, for example, the beautiful iconic tree of the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary with a huge root system that juts out into the water. Otters use these roots to den, and that's where they give birth to pups. And they might move between two or three denning sites. They might not show loyalty to any one denning site all through. And this is essentially a safety mechanism that they do have, particularly at the sort of mid stages after the birthing that happens sometime in the November to January time frame, right? So a holt is another name for a den, just as a pack of otters is called a romp. It's also called a pack, it's also called a raft, but let's call it a pack or a romp just to be, just to, take normal common nomenclature into consideration. Um, and here's another example of a holt. Now, the fascinating thing about this holt is that it's in the root of a bunch of trees, and otters are fun-loving animals in general. And the smooth-coated otter is no exception. And they do something which most otters, by the way, and the smooth-coated otters as well, they do something called tobogganing. And tobogganing is essentially going down the slide of the riverbank into the water and then coming back again. And they do this multiple times. And the whole pack or the romp gets involved in this. And they seem to just completely love the process. So they enjoy themselves doing it, and it's really fun to be on the opposite bank with a pair of binoculars and watch them. They could be doing this on a river island in the middle of the river or on the bank of the river, right? So the fascinating thing about otters is that they live in these packs with very high levels of rules. And just like in the case of an elephant herd, where the matriarch seems to be the dominant one, in the case of smooth coated, certainly, I can tell you it's the matriarch that dominates as well. A senior matriarch of sorts. The males, often the young males and sometimes the not so young males, are at times ejected out, and you find them roaming up and down the river as individuals. At times they join the pack, certainly at the time when the pups are born, and you have, in fact, maybe a couple of packs coming together as well, right? But then they disaggregate around this time, around May. And then after the monsoons, they tend to move into smaller streams and canals to avoid the fury of the main riparian river ecosystem and the flow itself. So they take shelter in some of the streams or the lakes that are at the end of some of these streams. And that's how you get reports often of otters in lakes or otters in tanks, which really is not their natural ecosystem. Fascinatingly, last year there was a report of a single otter in Tiruvannamalai, way away from the nearest river, about 20-25 kilometers. And then nobody cited it after a few months. It's not been cited this year. So it's just one of those puzzling questions. How did it get there? Right? But for sure, it was a smooth-coated otter. Uh, and these, I've talked to you about, the fun and games they do and about the sort of pack structure or the hierarchy in the romp and so on. The other aspect of the otter is their sheer bravery and courage and how they work as a team. And for a moment, I'm going to stop sharing this presentation, and instead, I'm going to share a video. Some of you may have already seen this video, but if you haven't, I can tell you it's really very interesting, right? But before I get into this video, do know that those of you who have seen the marvelous film Wild Karnataka will know that there's a lovely clip there where a pack of otters or a romp of otters actually push a tiger away from the riverbank. They actually get the tiger to go away. So they're really brave and they work as a team. And let's, for the next 2 minutes, look at a fascinating interaction between otters and the mugger crocodile in the Kaveri River. This is part of Planet Earth. I hope you can hear the sound.
Mugger crocodiles 4 meters long could easily take a single otter. Confident in their gangs, the otters will actively harass these great reptiles. Team play wins the day.
I hope you enjoyed watching that lovely little clip. I've seen it 100 times, but I can never get over it. Right? So to summarize, I mean, here is this marvelous animal. It's a mammal. It's there in the river as a small little fellow, and as a pack, as a romp, they, in many ways, are the apex predators of the river. Right? And they work as a team. They live as a team. But I'm still not done. There is another aspect to it that brings in a sense of collaboration and compassion. And this was beautifully documented in Sanctuary by Danish Shastri, who, along with a friend, was watching a romp of otters in the Ramganga River. And as you can see from this photograph, what he noticed was that this female was injured and bleeding and with a mangled left paw. Fascinatingly, the other animals in the romp or the pack were collecting fish, were catching fish and bringing it to this female for its food. And this sort of collaboration is just heartwarming to see. We see it in certain species. We see it in elephants, for example. Very common behavior. And another interesting correlation with elephants is when there are pups in otters, the duties of looking after the pups are shared among the females, right? Which we also see in elephant behavior. So fascinating stuff that you can learn just by watching otters, by reading about otters and learning more about them. Having said all of this, and I've now been going on and on for the last 20 minutes, let's talk about the otter and its habitat. And this is, of course, the Terminalia arjuna tree. I have a very good friend, Deepti, who's on this call, who's worked on the Kaveri ecosystem and knows it inside out and knows this tree far better than I do. This is an iconic tree. And otters den in the roots of this tree. And two other unusual species in the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary also use this tree hugely. One is the grizzled giant squirrel and the other is the lesser fishing eagle. It's not as other species don't use it, but these two are the sort of unique species of the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary that seem to use it a great deal. So in a sense, protecting the otter and protecting its habitat are hugely correlated. Some years ago, actually a couple of years ago, two times I have been asked this question: why do we need to protect this species? From people who are kind of throwing it to me as a bit of a challenge, right? And my answer to that is we don't really need to justify protecting a species in its natural habitat, right? They have as much right there as we do in our natural habitat. So we don't need to justify it. However, there are 2 points to consider. The first is what my colleagues and I have realized at River Otter Conservancy, which is the volunteer group that we run, that when any effort at protecting the otter involves protecting its habitat, either cleaning up its habitat or restoring its habitat. Therefore, riparian buffers, removing pollution, issues like that are intrinsic to its habitat and by extension to the otter, and by further extension to us. The other fascinating part was detailed in this photograph taken by my good friend Hanumant, who's probably listening in on YouTube as well. So this is an otter, and this was taken earlier this year, actually, when we were in the Kaveri. This is an otter picking up or catching an African catfish, an invasive species. And for those of you who know about African catfish, I need to say no more. For the others, very briefly, it's a species that has taken over the riparian ecosystem in the worst way possible in many of the rivers of South India for sure. And it's an omnivore, and it has destroyed native fish populations. And the otters have in a way adapted because they've seen their food diversity shrink as well. And we have multiple incidences from fishermen, but this is the first photograph that I've seen where there is an otter that's actually consuming an African catfish and thereby doing a big service to the ecosystem and to us. The African catfish, by the way, has absolutely no value as food for humans. In fact, its consumption at sale is actually banned in this country. Right? Having said that, humans have not done a great deal for otters. On the contrary, we have created a lot of trouble for them. And the first trouble we have created is by using dynamite that many people have used when they fish. Right? And you might say, well, this certainly kills a lot of fish, but how does it affect otters? Because there are reports of dynamite being used on otters. There are also reports where when fish have aggregated as a result of feeding by humans, otters have tended to follow, and then a dynamite has been thrown that has killed the fish and the otters. And this report is actually some years ago from Kushalnagar, which is in Karnataka. Another problem we have seen, therefore, as a consequence, what happens? Earlier this year, I got a photograph of a dynamited fish here. And this is an endemic fish of the Kaveri. I don't remember its name, but it's an endemic fish. Dynamiting is irreplaceably killing the life in our rivers, and therefore we are working a great deal to campaign against this. It's very tough. We can't say we are succeeding at all, but it's something we have to keep going at. Along with this, and who does this? These are not always the traditional fishermen. Some traditional fishermen do it because they are desperate. Very often it's done by people who come in from outside as well, right? Who are, I would say, occasional, recreational fishermen. The other threat comes actually often from traditional fishermen, and that is snares. And this is a snare that has been put next to some spraint that you see over here. And this clearly is a snare for otters. Sometimes a snare for some other small mammal might get otters in it as well. And we have been actually removing snares in some islands in the river. It's again a tough call. Working with fishers means engaging them because it's their livelihood at stake as well. It's the same sort of equation that people on terrestrial ecosystems have had when they were working with poachers. The next threat is the one of pollution. And pollution, in fact, I tell you, has taken two forms. One is what we understand here as, the plastic and the waste pollution that essentially leaves a city and enters a river. And this is a serious problem. And this is at Srirangpatna, where we have actually recorded otter populations, right? And they lead a very tenuous existence in this ecosystem. Along with this, there's also the other problem of glass bottles. This was in the Kabini Reservoir that I took in the month of April, in early April actually. Now, while it seems away from the reservoir, in the month of July, as the rainfall increases, this will all be underwater. And this is a threat to smooth-coated otters in the Kabini Reservoir. It's a threat to small cod in streams and in lakes and everywhere else. Just the fact that we are extremely irresponsible in the way we dispose of our waste. And then, need I say more? Roadkills. This is from Goa, and this is just so tragic. So what we are seeing here are multiple threats other than the systemic threats of sand mining, which I've not even talked about. Now, sand mining affects the otter because it removes their prey base. Essentially, a lot of fish lay their eggs in sand, and when you remove the sand, these fish disappear, right? And sand highly mined areas are also areas that otters have moved out of. So other than the systemic threats, and pollution incidentally is also a systemic threat, there are certain threats that are affecting these animals hugely. Let me tell you for a moment what Nicole, who's the head of the otter specialist group, had to say. And do read this while I get a quick sip of water. So otters, in a nutshell, are indicator species. They are our signposts in the river, our representatives in the river. They're telling us a story. And as I conclude, I just want to tell you, the least we can do is to listen to that story and take the steps that are necessary to make that habitat safe for them and for us. On that note, thank you very much. Do go to our website, riverotter.in. We are very proud of our website, and I'm extremely happy to take any questions, any comments, anything at all. Right? So thank you very much.